This recording is about international institutions and processes, and really here we're looking at international law. Now, international law is a really big topic, and to be honest, it's quite difficult to do it a great deal of justice with a dozen or so slides. However, in keeping with the slightly cynical outlook of some of these earlier recordings, the first slide is illustrating really the underlying realpolitik behind a big chunk of international law. And that's that idea that fundamentally, from the Westphalian model that we've discussed in earlier recordings, that there is no real higher power. And that theme in international law is really played out largely by the powerful nations in the world, with the United States being the sort of supreme or almighty. And with the example of the slide here, basically an international court here, the EICC, made a decision, and the Americans really don't have to follow it. And so that is something to leave on the back of your mind when going through and listening to this recording, this idea that international law has something of a reputation of being soft law, and that it doesn't somehow have to bind all of those subject to it. Another thing to note about international law is that there are lots of theories and theorists about how this type of law works. Some draw analogies from domestic law and try to extend that to the international arena. Other theories and theorists really think of it as something quite different and separate and unique and unto itself. When we're analysing international law, it can be a very helpful thing to start with the history, basically looking at how did the world get to the state that it's in now. Avid archaeologists and anyone who's played the computer game Civilization over the last 20 years might be aware that there was essentially four sort of great centres of early civilization, and they were all centred around rivers: the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus and Ganges rivers, and the Yellow and Yangtze rivers in China. Now, each of these small civilizations developed agriculture, and of course with agriculture we're able to sufficiently feed a larger volume of people, and as such could build a density of population. And it really is this idea of being able to sustain a sufficiently large population in a small area that leads to the idea of the city-state. Each of these areas has its own rules, its own laws, customs and traditions, and apply to really just the area in and around where that population centre is. Over time, human beings, as they want to do, would declare war on various neighbouring city-states, civilizations, and what have you. And so in these ancient civilizations, the rise of the first sort of empires, civilizations that spread over a larger area, a collection of cities essentially. So for example, the Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Harappan, the Indus Valley, the Egyptians formed something of an empire. These early empires had to deal with the idea of that, look, when we're going to another place and conquering the people there, how do we go about governing? And this sort of challenge was really dealt with in an ad hoc way. Some civilizations would just come, just kill all the local people, take their stuff, but generally the people in these conquered territories would remain, and how they would form part of your newly expanding empire was done differently in different regions and different areas. Now, from a legal perspective, you've got something of a challenge here. Hey, look, we the conquering people, we have our own laws and customs, and you, the people that are already here, you have your own customs. And so how, whether or not we try to, again, assuming there's no genocide, which was certainly on the cards, how does the conquering people interact with those that they have conquered? And really, this is one of the earliest places where we're looking at this idea of what and how international law works. how does one culture or civilization superimpose its values, its norms on another. And this isn't confined to simply these ancient world empires. You had subsequent empires. Alexander the Great, the Macedonians, he conquered through to the subcontinent. Later you had the Romans conquering in and around the Mediterranean, the various dynasties in China, and later the Mongols that had this huge land empire. Now, all of these empires, what they started to realize was that often it was in their best interests, when coming to a place, conquering it, saying this is now ours, to actually kind of, leave things the way that they are, to let the existing people carry on pretty much doing what they're doing. It's just that we now run the place. Change the logo on the sign at the front door. And most importantly, being able to take revenue from these places. And certainly by the time we come to the sort of later concept of the Westphalian model, this idea of leaving things intact had very much been the norm for thousands of years. Now, one of the interesting things about these empires that would be created where various people would go conquer others, rule for a while, and then slowly go into decline, get conquered by other areas, or each of the regions of an empire would just sort of break off. It goes back into smaller areas governed by themselves. One of the interesting things, though, is the role of religion here, and that idea that religion can both be spread through conquest. When we bring our laws and our rules and our customs and impose them on a conquered people, we can impose our religious beliefs as well in that instance. But religion can flow in a far more fluid fashion. The great word of one god or gods spreads from one town to another, and as such, people have a connection through this religious thread between them, often having some form of sort of law that's sort of intertwined with these religious beliefs. And so this idea of having this religious law, a sharia or canon law, however we describe it, that is something that can operate across geographic space, even when the actual rulers of the land are separate. And certainly, if we can think of examples of this in, say, the Christian and the Islamic worlds, where, for example, Iran has traditionally been Shia as opposed to other areas, the Arabian Peninsula, which was Sunni. And each of these threads of Islam have their own hierarchy. They have their own sort of leaders at the top, and the adherence to this stretches across wide geographic areas and locations. Similarly, if we think of Europe, and again, if we think before the Protestant Reformation started by Martin Luther, where Europe was predominantly Catholic, or what we would consider to be Christian, I suppose, but basically owing allegiance to the Pope in Rome. But the people themselves, the nations of Europe, would wage war upon themselves many, hundreds and hundreds of times throughout the history of Europe. And so you've got this connection between people that may be in sort of warring sides and factions in a place like Europe, but they still have the same thread, this idea of the religious laws, in so many ways binds them, and that flows from somewhere else, again from the Holy See. And so when we're thinking about international law, it can be helpful to think of it sort of beyond what most people think as the traditional structures. Another dimension in international law can be thought of trade networks. These operated between empires, between city-states, across geographical boundaries, and certainly in the sort of medieval European period, the merchants themselves would have their own rules. So people that worked and traded things along trade routes would develop their own customs, norms, rules, and sanctions. And this law, the lex mercantoria, is known as merchant law, and it was very much ended up being enshrined in a lot of common law practices. Now, the rulers of nation states and empires and geographical areas, they were always very keen to be able to regulate this in some way, largely to try and take resources from merchants who were becoming wealthy through trading along wider and further routes. But again, much like these empires that come and try to take over something, what rulers realise, or good rulers realise over time, is that you're much better off just letting merchants do what they do. In other words, don't mess with it. Don't try to interfere with the lex mercantoria. Don't try and change things to upset the proverbial apple cart. You're much better off let the merchants do what they do, let them resolve their disputes in the way that they do, and just tax them when they come through. And so that is one way, again, when we look at our contemporary systems, that has developed over this long period of time. And finally, we look at the actual concept of the nation state itself. Now, this is a relatively recent phenomena, and, as is discussed in earlier recordings, a sort of a seminal moment in this was the culmination, the end of the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia. And so we talk about this idea of the Westphalian model of sovereignty as existing from that time forward. So really sort of putting our fingers exactly on the point in time where we can tangibly say, at this point, the nation state itself is the highest form of government. There is no higher power. And arguably this notion of Westphalian sovereignty has been eroded, and some would say largely displaced by the UN model. But it's still very helpful to think in terms of the underlying power behind this. Going back to the first slide in this recording, the idea that the US, as possessing the most powerful military in the world, in many ways is not responsible. It doesn't have to really cede any underlying power to anything higher. When thinking about international law, there are lots of theories and theorists that will argue different concepts of what is international law and how can it be categorized. But for the sake of this recording, I'm going to split it into three concepts that I'm going to discuss in a bit more depth. We have firstly the idea of public international law. We also have this idea of private international law, and the idea of supranational entities, that idea of ceding one's sovereignty, or the nation state ceding sovereignty to other entities. I'm going to discuss each of these three in a bit more depth. So the first of these three aspects, public international law, is really the sort of type of international law that one would sort of naturally associate with this area. It's the relationship between nations, how they go about conducting their affairs and what they do, and really in relation to each other. Now, even though these relationships may concern citizens or concern companies or non-government organisations, it's really about how the nation states themselves thrash this out and come up to some form of agreement, and then how they go about enforcing that agreement. And again, it's helpful to remember at this stage that fundamentally there's no higher power here, and that at least ostensibly all nation states are on the same level, even if in practice some are much, much more powerful than others. And after the Second World War, after the United Nations was created, and these nation states, all of the nation states of the world, had the option of signing up to it, to become a member country. Now, not all nations are actually signed up to be in the United Nations, but the UN is the best and the largest, most important example of what we term intergovernment organisations. These are bodies that are set up by two or more governments that are designed to bring about a certain end. There are a lot of these organisations that, I guess the important thing to remember with all of them is that it's only countries that want to do it that sign up to these, and the extent of sort of how much they want to play is still really governed largely by the sort of the internal politics of each of the nation states itself. And now there's one sort of exception that I'll come to a little later in this recording, which is the Security Council. However, it's important to note that the UN is a very, very large organisation. It has many divisions, and each of those divisions has their own particular purpose and aim and objective. Now, the International Criminal Court is interesting in that it is an organisation which is established, and many nations have signed up to it, that is fundamentally about dealing with criminal matters that nation states can't deal with themselves. So usually things like war crimes. And well, if one thinks about it, if you commit war crimes, you do horrible acts of genocide, for example, but you commit those in the process of fighting some sort of civil war, then you end up being the leader of the country. If a body like this did not exist, then there would be no other place where you could really be tried. For example, you could just change the law of the land to justify, in terms of sovereignty story, every horrible thing that had happened up to that point. Now, another IGO is Interpol, which is basically an organisation which facilitates cooperation between law enforcement across jurisdiction. And Interpol is something that's started to have more and more importance as global markets and global systems of trade become more important, and networks that people have in terms of trade networks and crime networks exist across jurisdictions to a far greater extent than they once might have. Another IGO is the Commonwealth of Nations, also formerly known as the British Commonwealth, which was formerly known as the British Empire. These days, as an organisation, it's a collection of generally former British countries that agree to uphold a series of common good things. For example, trying to eradicate poverty, trying to keep systems of government which have a rights-centric culture, and to really push towards democracy, democratic systems of governance, and to reduce racism. The Commonwealth of Nations also enables member states to compete in the Commonwealth Games. And like all of the IGOs here, membership is optional. Now, as well as sort of political groups, there's also economic IGOs. Now, OPEC is an example of that, where in the late 60s, early 70s, a group or large block of countries that controlled oil production decided to get together and essentially just create a monopoly. And OPEC is made of a very disparate group of states, sort of geographically dispersed. The only one thing they have in common is that the countries that have a lot of oil, their headquarters is in Vienna in Austria. And I guess fundamentally the purpose of that IGO was to uphold the economic interests of each of those member states by creating this monopoly. The final two IGOs mentioned on the slide, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the IMF, are actually both United Nations bodies. They're subsidiaries or created by various arms of the UN. The first is really designed to give an objective sort of third-party opinion and do an investigation on climate change and report back to the constituent members, and also to provide information for policymakers globally. The IMF, on the other hand, is designed to really regulate balance of payments and the international currency supply. The IMF is a body that nations can borrow from under certain conditions, certain structural adjustment requirements that those economies have to have. Fundamentally, it's about creating a sort of global financial stability. On the slide, there's a diagram demonstrating how the United Nations itself is structured. And in many ways, it looks similar to how our system of government in Australia and in the state of Queensland is structured itself, in that there's a General Assembly, and that forms the core of it. It's the heart of the UN model itself, where each country, each nation state gets one vote. There are lots of branches of the UN, and we could again think of this analogy extending to how we would look at ministries, where each of the UN bodies represents a ministry in some ways, each of them set up to achieve a particular function, and are all still accountable back to the General Assembly itself. The analogy goes further. There's a head of state. That's the Secretary General. That's Ban Ki-moon, who's to be replaced. He retires at the start of 2017 with Antonio Banderas from Portugal, who become the new Secretary General. It's a 10-year term. There are also court systems, again, such as the ICJ and the International Criminal Court. Although here the analogy starts to really break down somewhat, and that's in some ways, well, I'll look at the ICJ in particular when we analyse the supranational aspect of it. Another area that it completely breaks down is the Security Council itself, and in particular the 5 permanent members having this right to veto decisions of the Council. And so indeed, in the words of George Orwell, each are equal, but some are in fact more equal than others. So I'm going to discuss for a little bit the process of entering into treaties. Now this is a really important aspect of international law, where 2 or more nation states come together, thrash things out, and actually go about changing their internal structure, their internal laws as a result of this. And so this process on the slide here of negotiating the parts of the treaty and then going through adopting it, coming together to sign it, to demonstrate that we wish to engage equally into this treaty, and then do this process of ratification, that is taking the existing structure of the treaty and enshrining it in our domestic law. Now, in Australia, we have what's called a dualist system, in that it's a requirement for us to go enter into these treaties and then go away as a quite separate process and enshrine it into law. This requires essentially a 2-step process, and most importantly, it requires 2 arms of government. And so the process of entering into treaties is not one that can be undertaken lightly, because it requires assent from Parliament. Now, as we're aware from earlier recordings, we have a Westminster system. What does that mean? It means that the heads of the executive, excluding the Governor-General, but each of the ministers and the Prime Minister are all MPs. In other words, they are all from the dominant party in Parliament, and as such, they are able to implement policy from that party because they control the executive and the Parliament. Where that could be a problem is time delay. Why? Well, because if it takes a long time to pass something into legislation, one government can come enter into a treaty and say, yes, the nation state of Australia agrees to enter into this treaty, but by the time it comes to actually pass the legislation, they may have been removed from power by the electorate. And so as a result, there's this awkwardness in our system when other parties or other nation states are looking upon Australia and say, what happened? You said you were going to do it. It was like, well, that was actually the previous government's idea. We're not so keen. And I think it's a useful thing to to really ponder, to think about. Is this a useful mechanism in our system of governance? And certainly this contrasts with the monist legal system, where usually through their constitution, in certain nations, when they actually assent to enter into a treaty, it automatically binds domestic lawmakers. In other words, it comes into effect, or can come into effect straight away. And there are systems that are a combination of the two. For example, there's some mere formality from either the Parliament or the executive arm of government to actually enshrine it in the domestic law sphere. Now, another facet of this, another thing to think about in terms of governance, is whether entering into these treaties actually undermines sovereignty, whether or not choosing to bind ourselves in terms of domestic law when we enter into these treaties and go through the process of ratification, whether that somehow reduces the nation's underlying sovereignty as a result. There's really sort of two sides to this, because in many ways, being a nation state, one of the most important things about actually being a nation state is to enter into treaties, to therefore bind internal law making bodies, and to adopt rules and principles from a wider, more broader international community. Certainly when we think of sovereignty and we think of the United Nations, fundamentally it's one nation, one vote. And so that the UN itself is really founded on this idea that nation states are still sovereign, but they, at least ostensibly, are supposed to be equal. Togo or New Zealand or Samoa, all these tiny countries, in theory have the same voting rights in the UN as China, the United States, and the UK. However, in practice, it's the Security Council that creates this imbalance. And it's also helpful to think that small countries, because they can be dwarfed economically by larger players, often their votes, and perhaps it pains me to phrase it this way, but in many aspects their votes are up for sale. An example of this, I visited Tonga a few years ago, and Tonga, as it happens, is actually a pro-whaling country. Why is this? Well, it's certainly not because the Tongan people love or enjoy the slaughter of whales. It's because there's a very strong financial contribution from the Japanese government in order to take that stance on that particular issue and vote in a certain way. And again, it's something to reflect upon in terms of governance, and we think of global governance, and we think about mechanisms that we can try to employ to offset that, because it's a very, very difficult thing. I'm going to shift the focus away from public and move towards discussing private international law. This is really about citizens and organisations inside jurisdictions dealing with other citizens and organisations in other jurisdictions. In other words, how do us as the small player inside a country deal with, sue or be sued by people in states and places that aren't subject to our domestic law. And there's a lot of different theories, and these theories are sort of expounded into the domestic law of the various countries. And the vast bulk of nations that get their law from codes from the civil law countries have quite strong rules really favouring the defendant. In other words, you can't pick and choose the jurisdiction that you want to sue someone in. You've got to sue them in their home country. Look, they don't say that that's the best rule, but it's certainly very salient. I'm a defendant, I reside in this country, I need to be sued in this country. However, most countries that derive from the British tradition, the common law nations, have a different rule. This forum non conveniens is the idea that you should take a particular dispute to the most appropriate place. And this was expressed by the House of Lords in Spiliada, where, and I quote, it's quite an elegant quote, in the present case, the vessel was managed partly in Greece and partly in England with a Liberian flag owned by a Liberian corporation, being damaged by cargo loaded by British Columbia, so a Canadian shipper, carried from Canada to India. Both sets of insurers are English. In that situation, it may be very hard to determine which is the most appropriate court in order to resolve this particular dispute. And it is something that the British courts, certainly the maritime courts of Admiralty, had, in that a lot of sort of private commercial dealings would have clauses in those contracts that, regardless of who the parties were, and regardless of who owned the boats, that they would be heard in the British courts. And largely that was because the British had a very well-developed system of laws, particularly involving boats as a maritime nation. And because it was well-developed and it was protected by the British government, essentially, that parties to a dispute would often realise that they may not win in the British courts, but at least they would have a fair hearing. Now, unfortunately, in Australia, our position is a bit closer to the, in some ways, to the civil law countries than the other common law ones, in that the Australian High Court really doesn't like moving things. So if a matter is brought about here and can be heard here, it has to be Australia has to be a clearly inappropriate forum in order for it to be moved elsewhere. And again, you can kind of see the reasoning on this idea that, well, we think we have a fair and robust system of government and people can be heard fairly. So people that are seeking to have it heard elsewhere, well, what are they trying to hide? What advantage are they trying to have? Fundamentally, what's wrong with our system? And so, as a result, this test in Voth is a little different from other nations, and as a result, it's more difficult to move decisions initiated in Australian courts elsewhere. Now I'll turn to the final of these three arms of international law, the idea of supranational law. That exists where there is a higher authority than the nation state. This happens where a sovereign nation cedes its power in some way to this higher authority. And fundamentally, there aren't many examples of this. Why? Because we don't like ceding our domestic sovereignty to other parties and places. And so some examples where it does come up is the International Court of Justice, or ICJ. Now, arguably this actually can fall under public international law because the ICJ resolves disputes between nation states, but it only comes up if both of those states consent to actually take it there. In other words, look, the ICJ can rule on a dispute between two nation states, provided they both agree to be bound by the decision. So in that sense, it can be thought of as a supranational institution, even if it's not a court in the traditional sense, because, well, let's face it, you can just elect to not have the matter heard there and just refuse to go. There may be a political cost of that internally, and between other nations, you may become the subject of ridicule and contempt, but fundamentally, you either go or you don't go. And where it's going to be patently obvious that a particular nation state is going to lose, they often decline to actually go to the ICJ to have the matter heard. The ICJ itself is structured much like a court, how we would perceive a court to run. And interestingly, these international courts are very much established and set up to look like courts, what one would traditionally associate them to be. They're set in beautiful old buildings, and the judges and sort of lawyers that operate in these environments wear the full regalia. I'll turn now to what happened in Europe and the concept of European supranationalism that occurred after the Second World War. Now, very gradually, after the war, where pretty much nations in Europe that had been fighting each other for literally thousands of years decided to start cooperating. And part of doing that was to create this European environment. This led to the creation of the EU itself and the institutions of European supragovernance. Now, the European Parliament is a collection of people that are elected in each of the jurisdictions. There's around about 750 members to it, and they sit and vote and operate like a parliament on matters of European law. And European law sits and operates separately in a very similar way to how federal law operates in Australia, in that it doesn't, strictly speaking, offset or detract from particular areas that the states had, or certainly didn't at the time of federation. It just enumerated a list of powers and things that they can have power to pass laws on. And one of the reasons for having that is to really to facilitate this cooperation between countries. Now, the European Court of Justice is an appellate court, in that where a domestic in a particular country in Europe, a person has reached the highest court in that, but the issue is to do with European law. There is this further Court of Appeal, and that Court of Appeal, decisions from that will trump the decisions that were made by the courts in that member state. The European Court of Human Rights is created by a statute, European statute, that again sets up this particular court, that a person who believes that there's infringement in one of the member states can then go through this separate court system in order to again have a determination, which is then binding back on the original state. Now, the position of the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom and its relationship with Europe and European law was analysed in a series of cases involving Spanish shipping or fishing company over a very long time. I believe that it was first heard in 1989, and the final of 6 cases was delivered final judgment was delivered around the turn of the century. These are the factor-tame cases, and the net result, to summarise a very complex, long-worded series of cases, was that yes, the United Kingdom is subject to European law. The UK doesn't have a written, structured, formal constitution. It's essentially a collection of lots of documents. And this legislation that was passed in order for the UK to enter into the EU and to take part in Europe essentially forms, I guess, almost a constitutional, additional constitutional documents, and they will trump the laws of Britain. Why is that? Because Britain signed up to be in the EU, or at least they did until recently with the British exit or Brexit vote, where they're now choosing to retract from that. The process to do this will be extremely difficult. Finally, I'll turn to the most important entity, in fact probably the most important single entity or organisation in the entire world. The United Nations Security Council is the international body that can issue and directly authorised and enforced through getting member states to conduct affairs, force. It is the body which condones the use of military force in our world. And it was founded after the Second World War by the winners. And it's by no coincidence that the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, China and France were the winners of World War II. And they hold a special place in the Security Council, along with 10 rotating seats, in that each of those nations have the power to veto if a decision is made by the Council to authorise force or to perform any other action, any of those states can veto that action and essentially negate the council's decision. Most importantly, the council, the veto that those 5 members have, prevent other member states from having a permanent seat on the council itself. So, for example, China in recent times has vetoed the other 4 member states wishing to induct India into this into the permanent seats of the council, because, again, through no coincidence, the 5 permanent members are the only states that are authorised officially to have nuclear weapons. Other states are expressly forbidden from doing that, and so nation states that do have nuclear weapons, who aren't in that group of 5, are just blatantly, flagrantly flouting international law. And so I guess in many ways it's fitting to end this series of recordings by explaining or expressing where the Security Council sits in not just our system of governance, but in terms of global governance. It is at the top. It is the entity which fundamentally has the most power of any body or organisation on the planet. It's not democratic. It was created after essentially a world war, a great crisis, where it was all of these sides against all of these other sides, and the world was divided into winners and losers. That is fundamentally something that we struggle with from a nation state level, but we're still sitting with it at the international level. And maybe that just reflects history, in that contemporary separation of powers, the rule of law, all of these systems of governance that we have domestically in the state of Queensland and in the nation of Australia have been developed over hundreds and hundreds of years, whereas the UN as an entity, it's not even 100 years old. Perhaps it's one of those things where we hope for the best, but we know that over time, if we keep pushing towards reform and making changes and making ourselves heard as a nation state, that this may be reformed, but I suspect it won't be. At least not within my lifetime. I hope to all of the people that have been listening to these recordings that they've been useful, educational, and from time to time interesting.